So this lesson, what we're going to look at in Beginning to be a Chemist is looking at understanding how we can change states of matter, and we're going to look at how that happens in a chemistry lab, and also we're going to look at how that happens naturally in something called the water cycle. So by the end of today's lesson, what we'd like you to be able to do is to describe the process of a solid turning into a liquid turning into a gas, and the reverse processes, a gas turning into a liquid and a liquid turning into a solid. So be able to name those processes and also to be able to see those processes and understand them from the water cycle. Now, in the previous lesson, we learnt that when you heat up a material, it expands. It gets bigger. When you cool something down, it contracts, it gets smaller. Now, with water, if we keep heating up water, what happens to it? And if we keep cooling down water, what happens to it? So I'd like you to think about that. If you want to, you can write down your predictions, pause the video and write down your predictions. Otherwise, you can keep it in your head and we move on to the next slide. So heating and cooling water. Water can exist in all three states of matter. So it can exist in its normal form, the middle picture, as water. And water, when we call it water, it is a liquid. When we cool water down, we can turn it into a solid, and we call it ice. Now, when we heat water up, when we boil it and heat it up enough, we can turn it into a gas. Now, that gas is not called steam. That gas is called water vapor. So it's really important. Steam is a mixture of water vapor and liquid water together. But we need to know that the gas form of water is called water vapor, the liquid form of water is called water, and the solid form of water is called ice. Now, if we want to form ice from water, we cool it down, we remove heat energy from it. If we want to turn water into the gas form, we heat it up. We give it heat energy. So water turns into ice by cooling it down. Water turns into water vapor by heating it up. And we call those processes freezing. If we turn a liquid into a solid, we call it freezing. If we turn a liquid into a gas, we call it boiling. We can also do the reverse processes. So we can turn ice into liquid water, and we can turn water vapor, that's a gas, into liquid water as well. Now, how we do that, if we want to turn ice into a liquid, we have to give it heat energy. And we call that process melting. Where we have water vapor as a gas, and we want to turn it back into liquid water, what we do is we cool it down. We take heat energy away. And that process is called condensing. So you might have heard of condensation, that liquid, those drops of water that appear on the windows on cold days. Condensation, what is happening there is the water vapor in the air, as it's hitting the cool glass, is turning into liquid water, and we can see it. So it's condensing, and that's why we call it condensation. So just to show you what's happening to the particles whenever we start to heat things up. So we know when we have a solid and we start heating up, it expands and the particles get further away from one another. If they get so much energy that they are able to start moving, they're no longer completely touching and they're able to start moving, that's when we call it melting, and it has turned from a solid into a liquid. In a liquid, if we keep heating it up and the particles expand and get further away from one another, it eventually turns into a gas, and we call that boiling. So you can see in each time as we heat it up, the particles get slightly further apart, it is expanding, and that's because they get more energy. And when it completely transforms from a solid into a liquid, we call that process melting. When we completely turn a liquid into a gas by giving it enough heat energy, we call that boiling. When we cool things down, we're going to start on the right-hand side here with the gas. When we cool down a gas, we're taking energy away from the particles and they get close together. Once we've taken enough energy away from the particles that they're now touching one another, it turns into a liquid. And we call that process condensing. The gas turning into a liquid. With a liquid, if we keep cooling it down and keep taking energy away from the particles, eventually they stop being able to move properly and they can only vibrate. And it becomes a solid, and we call that process freezing. When we put it all together, this is what we need to remember. A solid turning into a liquid is called melting. A liquid turning into a gas is called boiling. And those two arrows are in orange there to show that we are putting heat energy in. We are heating it up in order to do that. At the bottom part of the diagram, we see a gas turning into a liquid, and that process is called condensing. And the liquid can turn into a solid through a process called freezing. Those arrows are in blue to show that we are cooling it down in order for that to happen. So what I'd like you to do now is come up with as many examples of the following processes as you can. Some of them might be easier than others to think of, but just write down as many examples as you can. So you can pause the video to give yourself time to do that. Just see how many examples you can come up with. Okay, so I'm hoping you've come up with a lot. What we're going to do is we are going to think about 2 practical activities to demonstrate these processes. So the first one, and this is one if you're in class we'll be able to do, if you are at home and you're in a position to do this, it is a candle, the candle, obviously before you do anything like this, you need to make sure that you're allowed to, because it is fire, and so you do need to be completely safe. But if you're not in a position to try this, you can see in the picture on the right hand side that when you light a candle, it starts to melt, and it actually drips down the side of the candle, the liquid wax. As that wax cools down, it turns back into a solid. Now, you might not have thought that that process of the wax turning back into a solid, we actually call that freezing. So the heat from the flame on a candle melts the wax, turns it from a solid into a liquid. But as it drips down the side of the candle and hardens, that hardening is actually called freezing because it's cooling it down. And this demonstrates that you don't need to bring something, you don't need to put something in a freezer to freeze it. Some materials freeze at room temperature. And candle wax is one of them. Candle wax needs to be heated up in order to melt. And so when it comes back down to normal room temperature, it freezes back into a solid. The next example is with a kettle. And again, kettles are really hot, so if you are practicing this at home, be careful. How you can demonstrate this process is you can see boiling and condensing happen. You fill a kettle with water and boil it, and we know that boiling is happening inside the kettle. That's what it's designed to do. And we see water vapor and steam come out of the kettle. If you hold something cold, so it could be a plate that you've put in the fridge to make it cold, if you hold that just above the kettle, about 30 centimeters above the kettle, and let the water vapor and steam hit it, you will see drops of water forming on that plate. And that's because that plate that you've kept in the fridge is cooling the water vapor down to water, and it's turning back into liquid on the plate. And so that is representing condensation or condensing happening. The kettle is boiling it by heating it up. The plate is cooling it down and it's turning back into water. So you can see these processes happening even in your own home all the time. Now what we're going to look at specifically is the water cycle. Now this is how the processes of freezing, melting, boiling and condensing happen in nature to water, and how that leads to things like weather. So the water cycle represents water always changing in nature. So water naturally exists as water vapor. It exists as liquid water, and it exists as ice. Now we'll start the water cycle with water in the ground. So at the bottom of the diagram we have got these oceans, we've got lakes, we've got streams, and we've got groundwater and surface runoff. What happens is that heat from the sun is able to evaporate. Now evaporation is a very similar process to boiling. It just uses less energy but takes a longer time. And that is another way in which liquid water can turn into gas. So evaporation is similar to boiling. It turns a liquid into a gas, but evaporation is a slower process and uses a lower temperature. Now, once that water has evaporated, it is now a gas. And gases go up into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is quite cold. So that water vapor is cooling down and eventually it condenses. Now, believe it or not, that liquid water can actually stay in the sky for a while. And as it condenses, that water in the sky we call clouds. So clouds are condensed water. And that water eventually does have to make it down to Earth. Because what goes up must come down. Now that water, if it comes down in the form of water, we call that rain. However, if the clouds get really cold, the water will actually freeze. And the water will freeze and turn into ice or snow. And if the water falls back down to Earth as a solid, we call it hail, sleet, or snow. Now there is one word that describes all of the ways in which water comes back down to Earth. So rain, snow, sleet, and hail together are called precipitation. So that's that word at the right-hand side of the diagram. Any way in which water falls back down to Earth is called precipitation. Then when water falls back down to Earth, depending on where it is, it might freeze if it's on top of a mountain, or stay as snow, or ice if it's on one of the ice caps, or it could directly flow into rivers, lakes, and be liquid water. And from that process, it can start again. Once it's water on the surface of the Earth, it can evaporate again. And this cycle is constantly going on and is the reason why we end up with weather that's constantly changing. So water evaporates from the ground, condenses to form clouds, and it falls back down as precipitation. If the temperature is very cold, the precipitation will be a solid, and we'll call it ice or hail. If the temperature is not so cold, it will stay as a liquid and it will fall down as rain. So just to summarise that, water covers about 71% of the Earth's surface. Ice in glaciers, the ice caps and mountains, can melt to form liquid water, and liquid water is able to evaporate into the air. As water vapour rises, it cools and condenses to form clouds. As clouds condense, it becomes difficult for the water to stay in the air and it must fall as precipitation. Now, precipitation, we'll call it rain if it is a liquid. However, if the temperature is really low and it freezes, the precipitation will fall as ice, snow, hail, or sleet. So this slide is just a summary of the processes that you need to know and hopefully can remember from this lesson. So a solid turning into a liquid, you need to heat it up a lot, and that process is called melting. Turning a liquid into a gas, you need to heat it up, and that process is called boiling. Turning a gas into a liquid requires you to cool the gas down, and when it turns into a liquid, that process is called condensing. A liquid turning into a solid, you need to cool it down, and that process is called freezing. And we see these 4 processes happening within the water cycle. So that has been a summary of changing states of matter, and I will see you next time.